So good afternoon. My name is Erica Zielewski. I am a senior analyst in the Office of Management and Budget in the Economic Policy Division. Congratulations, you made it to the end of day 2 of RECS. And to reward you, we have a great treat planned for you. We have a wonderful panel discussion on subsidized employment and other strategies for the hard to employ. So in addition to welcoming folks here, I want to welcome our viewers on the live stream as well. During the next 75 minutes, we're going to talk about strategies to serve those who are very hard to employ and move them into employment and economic self-sufficiency, with a particular focus on evidence from one approach, which is subsidized employment. Work is central to the lives of Americans. Economic self-sufficiency and the ability to provide for oneself and one's family is really a tenet of the American dream. This administration has recognized and stressed the importance of work and has made this clear through a series of actions, including executive order, the president's budget, and several new opportunities to give states flexibility to test different engagement approaches. Yet we know that for many individuals and families, work and that pathway to economic self-sufficiency and well-being remain elusive. The federal government, through programs like TANF and other things that you've heard about at this conference, is really committed to helping low-income families get on that track to economic self-sufficiency and well-being. But for some, finding and keeping a job, and a good job that pays sufficient wages and has benefits and has opportunities for progress, is difficult. We think about individuals with limited skills, disconnected youth, individuals with physical and intellectual challenges. You know, the challenge to getting some of these people into what we would consider good jobs and on the path to self-sufficiency, the challenge is real. But out of difficulty comes creativity. And thankfully, we've developed a number of approaches and responses to address this very issue and figure out how to move these hard-to-employ populations into non-subsidized employment. So during this discussion, we'll hear about a range of strategies, and you'll hear quite a bit about one strategy that's been studied, which is subsidized employment. So Dan Bloom and Cindy Redcross will focus on this approach and share broadly kind of what we know about its effectiveness in supporting unsubsidized employment, including some evidence from 2 recent studies funded by the federal government. So I don't want to scoop you guys, but I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and tell you why I'm especially excited to be here to moderating this panel. So back in the early part of this decade, which I say that and it seems like it wasn't that long ago, but it's 2018, so it really was that long ago. Both HHS and DOL were starting major evaluations of subsidized employment programs for hard-to-serve populations. Now, the populations were a little bit different. So in HHS's case, there was a focus on TANF clients and noncustodial parents and disconnected youth. For DOL, the focus was also on noncustodial parents, but also a reentering population, although recognizing there's a big overlap between the two. So Dan and Cindy are going to tell you more about those studies and the findings, but I want to tell you a different story about that, and that is what I think is a pretty great story about the power of collaboration and coordination in the federal government. So full disclosure, I'm an OPRE alum, and I was the project officer of HHS's study and helped to design it and get it off the ground with my colleagues Mark Fucello and Gurley Wright. I don't know where they are, but I know they're, well, I see Mark. I don't see Gurley, but I know she's there. So as these 2 studies were launching, our respective agency leaders, as well as OMB, really pushed us to make sure that our studies were coordinated and conducted in concert so that we could use our limited resources effectively. So what this means in practice is that we shared resources. In fact, 2 of DOL's sites were actually evaluated as part of HHS's study. We used common data collection instruments to make sure that we were measuring the same things in the same way at the same points in time. There are coordinated reports or common reports and other coordination. And I also want to just recognize Eileen Pedersen, who is also out here somewhere, who from the Employment and Training Administration, who is a great collaborator with us throughout. So, you know, frankly, I think the 2 studies are stronger for this collaboration, and it's a really wonderful example of government at its best, coming together to work together to support evidence, and I'm just really proud of it. So I'm personally excited to be here. So that's enough from me. You want to hear from these people, and I understand that. So let's move on to the real action. So I'm going to introduce each of our speakers now and lay out a plan for the session. I just want to say a word or 2 about each of them. I could go on and on. They're very esteemed folks, but you can read their bios on the app or the old-fashioned way, which is like, you know, you could also Google them. But if I went through their whole bios, we would never get to what they have to say, so I will move on. So to start the session, we'll hear from Dan Bloom. If you know anything about subsidized employment research, you know who Dan Bloom is, but Regardless, he directs MDRC's work on groups seeking to gain a foothold in the labor market, including former prisoners, disconnected young adults, low-income noncustodial parents, welfare recipients, and others. Since joining MDRC in 1988, Dan has co-authored more than 40 research reports and contributed articles to many published volumes on workforce and youth policy. Dan directs HHS's Subsidized and Transitional Employment demonstration, which you'll hear about shortly. To his left is Cindy Redcross, who is the Deputy Director of MDRC's Youth Development, Criminal Justice, and Employment Policy area. Cindy's expertise is in random assignment evaluations of programs that serve individuals involved in the criminal justice system. Currently, she's leading several projects that are evaluating interventions that target former prisoners and others involved in the justice system, including the Department of Labor's multi-site enhanced transitional jobs demonstration, which we'll hear about shortly, as well as NIJ's demonstration field experiment, What Works in Reentry Research. So following Dan and Cindy's presentation, we're thrilled to have three discussants who are even further to my left, who will share their views and reflect on this important topic and kind of tell you their take on things. So in alphabetical order, I'll start with Clarence Carter. If any of you were here yesterday for the morning plenary to start this conference, you know who Clarence is. But if you weren't, he is the director of the Office of Family Assistance at ACF. Previously, he founded the Institute for the Improvement of the Human Condition, which worked with state and local safety net agencies to meet the emergency needs of vulnerable citizens. He has served extensively in social service programs around the country, including in the Arizona Department of Economic Security, the Virginia Department of Social Services, and the Washington, D.C. Department of Human Services. Next is Grant Collins. Grant is Senior Vice President of Fedcap's Workforce Development Practice Area, which includes providing services for 65,000 individuals under a work requirement. Some of their programs include Breaking the Cycle, which provides statewide services for Maine's TANF program, and the Riker Smart program with the New York City Department of Corrections. Grant also has a connection to ACF. He served as Special Assistant and Senior Policy Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Children and Families and Deputy Director of OFA within ACF. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Harry Holzer. Harry is the John Lafarge S.J. Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University and is an Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research. He is also a non-resident Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at Brookings and is an affiliated scholar with several poverty research institutes. He's the former chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor, and he co-founded the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality and has published extensively, including several books. Again, if you know anything about employment research, you know who Harry is, and we're very lucky to have him with us today. So I could go on, but you'd rather hear from them than about them. So with that, I will turn it over to Dan and Cindy.
Thanks, Erica. You neglected to mention the one brilliant thing the two agencies did to facilitate the collaboration, which was picking the same organization to run both projects. But I know that wasn't a collaborative decision. So I'm going to start off with some general information about subsidized jobs. And the first question is, what is a subsidized job? This is not a beautiful definition, but I said it's a job in which all or part of the wage is paid with public funds as part of a special program. And I particularly said a special program because I'm standing in a room full of people whose wages are mostly paid by public funds. And they probably don't consider themselves to be part of a subsidized employment program. So just trying to be careful. There are many different structures, amount of subsidies, who is the host employer, who is actually the employer of record, many different names for these programs, community jobs, community service jobs, transitional jobs, but it's a whole cluster of different kinds of programs under this general heading of subsidized jobs. So why do we do these things? One reason that we create subsidized jobs is to put money in people's pockets when there aren't enough jobs for everyone who wants to work. The U.S., we've done that a few times during periods of very high unemployment. The most famous was, during the Great Depression. The most recent was during the Great Recession, most recently when states got funding under the TANF Emergency Fund and created a large number of subsidized jobs. So that's sort of that's sort of the one that most people are probably familiar with. I would say the success of a program like that would be measured by how fast can you get it up and running, how many people can you employ in sort of, real jobs and get money into people's pockets. Then there's this other purpose of some subsidized job program, not all, where the purpose is to use the subsidized job as sort of a training tool, essentially, to help people learn to work by working. getting hands-on work experience. In those cases, for those programs, I think success is measured in part, at least, by the post-program outcomes. So what happens after people are finished with a temporary subsidized job, because there's an explicit goal of using the subsidized job to teach people, to make people more employable, essentially. And then there's other goals depending on the program, reducing recidivism, you'll hear more about that later, reducing welfare receipt, and then sometimes people in subsidized jobs are working on projects that improve their communities, and so that can be an important outcome as well. And if you think back to the WPA and the Great Recession, they built lots of things that are still here around today, and that's the very important thing. So, and I will say that for that middle category, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about today, programs that had an explicit goal of trying to improve people's employability and long-term outcomes, the targeting is usually at people who are considered hard to employ, hence the topic of this session. So what do we know from recent evidence and experience? And this is just not a full list, but a selected list. There were a bunch of randomized control trials that were done in the last decade, now that you reminded me that we're almost done with this one, of transitional jobs programs. Most of them targeted people who are formerly incarcerated. There's the experience of the TANF emergency fund programs that I mentioned, and then there are the two projects that Erica introduced that are still ongoing. And just to note one other difference between them besides the target groups, which you heard, is that the ETJD project, the Department of Labor project, gave sites about $40 million, picked 7 sites and gave them a total of about $40 million to run these programs. The STEAD project didn't have a particular funding stream attached to it. So in DOL's case, it was a demonstration project that gave out funds. Okay, so just quickly, some overall findings and lessons. So the TANF Emergency Fund, we learned, and maybe we learned something that we had learned before and we relearned, which is that these programs can be scaled up quickly. This, in a matter of a very short time, most states set up subsidized employment programs, employed somewhere around 250,000 people, very, very quickly. They were broadly popular, sort of across the aisle. There were governors of both parties that spoke very positively about these programs. Interestingly and differently from many of the earlier programs, many of the placements were in the private sector, where businesses were getting subsidies to hire people. And then the programs dramatically scaled back, or in many cases ended when the federal funding expired, which suggests that they probably needed that federal funding to keep the programs running. Okay, so what about these transitional jobs evaluations, these randomized control trials that we've done? What have we learned? First, these programs can successfully target people who are unlikely to work on their own, right? And that's the first goal of any of these programs. Many different program structures are feasible. We've seen these run in many different ways by many different kinds of organizations. All of them have managed to put people to work in real jobs. And that's baseline feasibility question, I think, has been answered a number of times. The actual placement rate in transitional jobs, so I'm not talking about post-program now, I'm talking about in the program, tends to be higher when the jobs are in the nonprofit or public sector, and I'll show a picture of that in a minute, and when the placements are immediate. So when people go to work right when they enter a program and don't have to go through a lot of pre-employment activities, and that's predictable. Important to note, many people leave these programs, leave the transitional jobs before the job actually ends. So you shouldn't have a picture of it's a 4-month job, people go work for 4 months and they get kicked out of the job. Many people actually leave for both good and bad reasons before they get to 4 months. Most of the programs that we studied did not teach what I would call hard skills. They were not occupational training programs. The jobs mostly did not require a high level of skills. Impacts on post-program employment. If you've seen any talks about this before, you probably know that those impacts are small when they exist at all. And an interesting finding about some hints of improvement in subjective well-being while people worked in transitional jobs. I'll explain more about that in a minute. The Enhanced Transitional Jobs Demonstration, which has not released its final report yet, and I can't tell you the details, but I can say that some of the programs in that project do have somewhat more successful results than we've seen in the past, so just a little plug for the report when it does come out. Okay, so this is the typical chart. If you've seen me or Cindy or any of us present before, you've seen this picture before. We call it the TJ chart or something like that. The dark line, wait, can I get one more line? Oh, sorry. this was actually, I meant to have another line on there, but that's okay. Large impact on employment initially. We're counting the transitional jobs, right? So this is a very large impact on employment initially. It peters out after people leave the transitional jobs, and the question is whether it goes down to zero, okay? And in some programs, it's gone down to zero, and in some programs, same general shape, but the impact has been sustained a little bit longer. So this is this was a model, by the way, many models, actually. It's sort of an amalgam of many different programs, where people were placed in a nonprofit job or in the public sector, basically placed with an employer who would take pretty much anybody. This is what happens in programs. We don't have as long a follow-up here, but this is what happens in programs where the program attempts to place people with a subsidy in a private sector job. And it turns out that although many of the TANF emergency fund programs were in the private sector, when you try to place very hard to employ people in jobs in the private sector with subsidies, many employers won't bite, even with a subsidy. So if you want to target a very hard to employ population and get a very high rate of subsidized employment, you probably need to have a component of that at least that's in the nonprofit or in the public sector where people can, organizations essentially that will hire anybody. This is just illustrating the point I made before that the faster you place people into jobs, the higher the rate of subsidized employment. So for example, you look at all the way at the bottom in Indianapolis, the people typically got their first, started working their subsidized job within just a couple of days after they enrolled in the program, and lo and behold, they placed 100% of the people in subsidized jobs. Some of the other programs, more up to the top of the chart, there were various pre-employment activities people had to go through, and they lost people along the way. The one at the very top, Fort Worth program, tried to place everybody into private sector employment. It took a long time, and they only managed to get 39% of the people into subsidized jobs. So another illustration of what I was talking about before. Interestingly, the San Francisco program, the second one, which we'll hear about more in a minute, that program did not have a particularly high rate of placement in subsidized jobs. Fewer than half of the people in the program group worked in a subsidized job. But interestingly, it had pretty good post-program effects. And when you read the report, when it comes out, you'll learn that that may have had something to do with a very interesting child support related incentive that this program used, where they lowered people's child support orders temporarily while they participated, and it may have given people more of an incentive to work. We don't know, we can't prove that, but we think that may have been part of what was going on there. So what are some of the implications? If the goal is to improve long-term employment outcomes, so we're going about employability, improve long-term outcomes, I think we need to try to test some new kinds of models. We're getting maybe some modest, more positive effects in this enhanced transitional jobs demonstration, but I think we need to do something to build people's skills more than we have. I think the hypothesis that you can put people in a job that's essentially a low-wage, low-skill job, and the simple fact of them working for several months is going to make them significantly more employable, I think that's probably not true in most cases. So I think maybe models that have a bigger focus on occupational training, perhaps combined with subsidized employment in various ways, may be a promising avenue for future research. The other thing I wanted to say before I end, there's a lot of talk recently about subsidized employment. It's sort of risen up in the news recently. There are proposals for guaranteed jobs and a variety of other things going on in the Congress. To me, the results from these RCTs that I've just been talking about may not speak directly to the question of whether that's good public policy, because I think when people talk about a guaranteed jobs program, and I don't want to speak for the people that are proposing those, but I think they're generally saying that it's very important that everybody who wants to work be able to work, and that there are opportunities for everyone to work, and that they can essentially earn money in a socially desirable way through employment. Whether or not those programs lead to long-term improvements in people's employment outcomes, I think is, to me, a separate question. And so that's why I think these RCTs, which really did look at that long-term employment outcome as the main outcome, or recidivism in some cases, That's not exactly what we're talking about, I think, when we're talking about, a guaranteed jobs program. So I won't say one way or the other what I think about that. It's not my place, but I just don't think these RCTs are necessarily the answer to whether that's good public policy. So I'm going to turn it over to Cindy.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about a subset of programs of subsidized employment programs that targeted formerly incarcerated people. Okay. Did you? Just forward. Okay, great. Skipped one. Okay, skipped a slide. Okay, so what does prisoner reentry and recidivism have to do with employment? So I'll just, and that's not on the slide, this is just me talking. But basically, when we talk about prisoner reentry and we talk about recidivism, we often talk about employment. It comes up in that context. And we talk about hard to employ people. So former prisoners are actually a subset of this larger hard to employ group. And many of them likely have the same kinds of barriers that other people that are hard to employ have. So low educational attainment, lack of occupational skills, gaps in their work history, other kinds of barriers. And in addition to that, they also have a criminal record. So that's just an added barrier. But just wanted to make the point that many of them were hard to employ before they went to prison. So their only barrier is likely not just the criminal record. But employment is also one of the most important things that former prisoners consider upon release, as well as their parole officers and the programs that work with people coming out of prison. So employment is on the top of the list, and it probably will remain there. In addition, many of the characteristics that make people hard to employ are the same characteristics that might make them more likely to recidivate or commit crime in the future. So likely by targeting these kinds of characteristics and helping people overcome those barriers, there's also the potential to improve both employment and recidivism. Okay. So, and how might subsidized jobs programs improve employment and reduce recidivism? So there's, for both of these categories, so there's employment and earnings, and then there's a category of recidivism. For both of them, subsidized jobs programs could affect these outcomes both directly and indirectly. So for employment and earnings, similar to other hard-to-employ populations, subsidized jobs programs can improve people's employability. So they attend job readiness classes, teach them sort of soft skills about how to work, how to show up on time, that kind of thing, and generally make them more employable or more appealing to employers. They also work, many of these subsidized jobs programs include not only the transitional job, but they have job coaching and job development services. So they try to connect people with jobs, connect these participants with jobs that they couldn't access on their own. So the job developers go out and actually talk to employers, and they're working both with the employers and with the participants. So that's sort of, that's a direct way to affect people's employment and earnings. And then in terms of recidivism, so how might subsidized jobs affect recidivism? So that's, again, indirectly through employment. So if someone does have improved employment outcomes, they may also be less likely to recidivate simply because they're working. But then directly, these programs, as I mentioned, have other types of services that can change their attitudes and behaviors. So there's other things going on in the programs that might affect these attitudes and behaviors that tend to drive people to commit crime. Okay, so the lessons that I'm going to be talking about today actually draw from a range of studies that Dan already mentioned, and these studies started in 2003 and all the way through the present with the Enhanced Transitional Jobs demonstration, which is still ongoing in the final stages. So this is sort of a culmination of lessons across these random assignment studies. And in total, there were 8 subsidized jobs programs that I'll be drawing lessons from. Okay, so this looks familiar. Just wanted to illustrate to you that the effects that we see for former prisoners are very similar to the effects we see for the other populations. Essentially the same chart. As you can see, there were large increases in employment. So when people were entered the program, they immediately started working. We see large impacts. So, okay, and what we have learned across these 8 evaluations is that subsidized jobs can actually reduce recidivism. So this isn't guaranteed. We've seen this only in 2 of the 8 subsidized jobs programs that targeted former prisoners. But we know it's possible. So the question is sort of how. And when we talk about recidivism, we're talking about rearrests, reconvictions, and reincarceration. And those things are highly correlated. But to get the most complete picture of recidivism, we really should measure all 3 of those things. Any one on its own isn't going to give a complete picture. So what does this tell us? This tells us the fact that only 2 of the 8 programs reduced recidivism. It tells us that it can't be the job itself, because we did see that impact that we saw in all of the other programs with this big impact on employment. So even during that time, when we know that the program group was more likely to be working, we didn't necessarily see the impacts on recidivism in all of the programs. That tells us that the relationship between employment and recidivism is not straightforward, so it might not be causal. It might not go in the direction that we expect. Okay. Well, where we have seen a bit more consistency in terms of how subsidized jobs can affect recidivism is that when the programs target that high-risk subgroup, they tend to be more effective and more likely to reduce recidivism. So for those programs, we looked at the impacts on employment and on recidivism among groups that were categorized based on their level of risk of recidivating when they entered the program. And what we found there is that for the highest risk subgroup, we saw the largest reductions in recidivism, and we saw that in 4 of the 8 programs when we looked at that subgroup. So 4 of the 8 programs that targeted former prisoners did have reductions in recidivism for that particular subgroup. What we also tend to see, which criminologists wouldn't be surprised about, is that when you provide people who are low risk with very intensive services like subsidized jobs, you may actually have a negative impact. So the lesson here is just to be careful about the targeting. And for people who don't need that intensive help like that's provided by a subsidized jobs program, you could have negative effects. Okay, so in summary, what do we know? So we know that subsidized jobs it's almost guaranteed that there will be improvements in short-term employment and earnings. So that suggests that for people who are chronically unemployed, in and out of the labor force, if there's a subsidized job there available to them, their income will improve during that time period when they're in the transitional job. It's almost, as I mentioned, almost guaranteed as long as it's targeted appropriately. And we also saw that long-term improvements in employment and earnings are possible, but if we see that, and when we see that, they tend to be pretty small. So that means that people are still, even when we have those impacts, people are still struggling in the labor market. For this population, on the longer term unsubsidized employment, we tend to see that it's usually less than 50% at any given point are actually working, any given point in time. We also learned that subsidized jobs can reduce recidivism among the formerly incarcerated, but it's not guaranteed, and it's not clear exactly what mechanism is occurring. I can talk in a minute about some lessons, some sort of consistency that we saw in the programs that were effective, but we don't know for sure. We think that subsidized jobs we hear a lot about engagement and how difficult it is to engage people in services. And subsidized jobs, if nothing else, are pretty good at engaging people in services. So because they're showing up for work and they're getting paid, it makes them more motivated and available to, willing to participate in other activities that might be helping them improve their outcomes while they're there. So, and then also, the subsidized jobs programs they tend to be more structured. There's a job, they have to get up and they have to report to a job. So these programs tend to provide structure during a period of transition for former prisoners that when they first get out, may be a very uncertain period, so the structure may help. So overall, what are the lessons, the takeaways for how subsidized jobs can reduce recidivism? As we mentioned, targeting those at the highest risk of recidivism, likely to have bigger effects. So among those people who walk in your doors, you're already, it's already sort of a lower risk, but still high-risk people that are walking in the doors of the programs, and really just working to engage them right away, those that aren't necessarily as motivated to come back. What we also noticed for those two programs in particular that were most effective at reducing recidivism is that they were very experienced with the population, very engaged with the parole systems and the other criminal justice systems, the jails, really just knew their population and actually served exclusively that population. So that was an interesting lesson to take away. The programs were also, the most successful programs were also very highly structured. So people knew exactly what their day was going to look like. When they got up in the morning and they walked into the program, they knew that these were the things that were going to happen, and it happened every day. They knew their schedules, very structured. And also the programs that were most effective, given the high-risk nature of the populations that these subsidized jobs were most effective for, programs should probably consider other services that are sort of happening at the same time that might be affecting people's attitudes and behaviors. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. That was great. So I think with that, I'd like to turn it over to our discussants. I've asked each of them to spend a couple of minutes sort of reacting to what they just heard and kind of sharing their thoughts with you, and then we'll do some questions among the panelists and then open up for all of you to hear what your questions are. So I actually didn't plan this, but I was going to suggest we go Grant, Clarence, and Harry, and the seating worked out, so that means we should do it. So Grant, do you want to get us started?
Fantastic. So, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be in the room with the smartest people in America. So, just some quick observations, and then I have a little bit of other information I want to share with you. The first one is, I was wondering if there were any measurable differences between men and women regarding the transitional jobs. Another one would be, I've always been concerned about how models taper the subsidy, particularly if it ends abruptly. Is the employer more interested in getting the next person, or interested in, what I call the out transition of the transitional job? I look at it in two pieces. There's the in transition, and then there's the out transition. So I was going to spend most of my time being concerned about and talking about the out transition portion of that. And I noticed that there are implications for TJ evaluations and formerly incarcerated where there's at least some recognition that skills might be valuable and it should be considered in new models to test. And I would add to hard skills, job readiness skills. I would expand that to include job readiness skills, particularly interviewing skills, resumes that individuals can articulate, what we call packaging and responsiveness, the ability to open and close an interview and sort of command it prior to or complementary with the transition out phase. Not so much before they start, but perhaps alongside, but certainly before they transition out. Interestingly enough, we've provided the job and the work, and we've heard this from the two speakers already. But I would argue that we have not built the pathway or the bridge to long-term sustainable competitive employment, and that worker qualities that employers are looking for may not have been conferred fully through the work itself in the transitional job. I'm for any model or intervention that can unlock the greatness or potential that lies in a person, and providing a transitional job, if and when it's for the goal of long-term employment, in my view, requires more structure, both going in and particularly before exiting, as I mentioned before. I would be looking for the following factors. How clearly has this opportunity been communicated as temporary, yet designed specifically to improve long-term employability via three things? What does the person need to get out of this? Number two, that this is a source of recent viable work history and a credible reference. So can it be communicated very clearly that this engagement period, whether it's 90 days, 180, whatever the term, but that there are some very specific goals for it. And I would also add this to that. How has ownership of one's employment future been conveyed? So in the process of doing it, there has to be an ongoing thought of, okay, what's the future look like? What do you plan to leverage this to go get? What's the goal from here? How has urgency been conveyed or messaged? What is the plan? And how are you taking active steps towards it? The third one would be what I refer to as learn by doing, so that there's always an element of you don't actually have to be fully ready for the next thing that you do, but that you can actually learn on the job. And this should be an example, serve as an example during the transitional job of that very, very thing. And this notion of what I refer to as lifelong learning. So every time you go to a new plateau, you essentially start over. You're going to start over with new people. You're going to start over with new tasks, but that we need to socialize this point of change. And the next one is, can we motivate through productivity? Is there a way to help this person celebrate milestones along the way? Whether it's full attendance for, showing up on time for 2 weeks straight or whatever have you, there might be some opportunities to do that. Along with the inclusion of hard skills, employers say that they want people who are reliable, who take on projects, can be efficient, willing to learn new things and continue to adapt and learn. And I believe that those 5 principles sort of drive towards that. And that these qualities can be embedded in some additional structure via complementary job readiness, as I mentioned before, as a part of the out transition, and in so doing, improve the jobs getting skills of the job seeker. I think this would be a good model to study.
Good afternoon. Pleased to be back here again with you today. And I think I'm a little chagrined that Grant went in front of me because he stole everything I was going to say. Okay? But
It's the haircut.
But let me share, I guess, maybe a little bit of a different dimension. What I see in the ultimate results of these studies is that this approach to subsidized employment was an approach of a job for the sake of a job, not for a job as a pattern to grow capacity to ultimately reduce dependency. It is the flaw, the central flaw of the system of public supports, that it's one thing. It's either nutrition or it's education or it's cash. It is never one thing. Okay. The challenges that our consumer have, they're woven together. And so while employment is vital, it has to be in conjunction with the other aspects of the life of the individual. And so what I would argue, and this is what, to me, Grant articulated very well, is that those new models, they need to operate from the context of employment as an important component of the life of that individual, and how can you strengthen that individual's ability to not only get a job, but hold a job and grow in a job. And so if we were to think about subsidized employment from the perspective of, let's say that first job is not going to have a life-sustaining wage in most instances. So then what if you use the subsidy to enhance the level of earnings to be able to make that job closer to life-sustaining as you grow their capacity to hold a job that has higher wage. Okay? So again, it becomes part of a plan to incrementally grow the capacity of that individual to ultimately be able to act in their own best interest. Okay? So whenever the model is only focused on whatever the one thing is, that model will fail. And so that's what that's my reaction to the reports.
Clarence only spoke for 3 minutes. Can I take his 2 left over? And no, so the dominant reaction I have to the reports, and again, we haven't seen all the reports, just based on what we've heard, is that it actually doesn't look that different from what we had known going in. That the 2 dominant findings, number 1, that you have this big early spike in employment that mostly fades away, but maybe not completely, that holds up, and number 2, that sometimes there's a recidivism effect, but not always, not for everybody, not in every program. We've known that before, and so it's reinforced by these results. I found Cindy's discussion of for whom and when you get the recidivism effect and when you don't really quite interesting. Recidivism is very expensive. And I think it's hard to cost out all of the costs it imposes. You know, there's the administrative costs in the criminal justice system. There's foregone earnings for the people you're locking up. There's lack of child support payments for the family. And increasingly, we're finding evidence of strong intergenerational effects of incarceration. It really hurts the kids. And my guess is that there's no single study that can really cost all that out. But even a modest impact on recidivism that lasts could make these programs bring it much closer to cost effectiveness. And again, we'd have to see the details. But that was important. But in terms of sort of what else I'd like to see, let me sort of mention 3 things very, very quickly. First of all, so I align myself with the comments both of Grant and Clarence that, and Dan said, this probably more is needed. And the question is, what is that more? Probably something else that enhances, at a minimum, something that enhances the person's job readiness. Now, do we have strong evidence of what enhances job readiness among the hard to employ? The quick answer is no. I mean, we just don't have great evidence. And yet we all have the sense that some things could work. Making people more familiar with the obligations of employment. By the way, no one's mentioned substance abuse. And making sure people are substance free might well have a big impact on these lasting benefits. Helping them with child support. By the way, you know, when folks, a lot of these guys are in arrears on child support. When you're in arrears, you have a lot of incentive to disappear. Helping them manage their child support arrears could be another thing that might enhance these efforts. Making them eligible for an earned income tax credit. The next round of Paychecks Plus results are going to come out pretty soon. I can't say what they are. I was on the advisory team. There is some good news for this population. So that enhanced incentive might be something that helps this population. Some kind of certification. There's evidence that when employers see some kind of certificate of successful program completion of something, that sometimes makes them more comfortable with bringing these folks on. So again, there's a range of possible additional enhancements. Oh, and by the way, the skills of the job developer on the way out the door, you know, if they're not being kept on by their first employer, that could be very, you know, some job developers are very, very good and have very strong ties to local businesses, and some don't. That could be important. And finally, you know, work release programs pre-release could help sustain this. Is when you still have people and you can work on their skills. And I see Jillian Burke in the back, and I always like to pump her doctoral dissertation on positive effects of work release on subsequent earnings. Also adds, so there's little pieces that you might add to this puzzle, all of which might lead to sustaining effects. But, you know, the point that Dan made, that maybe we just can't keep expecting this one, and Clarence, you said this too, that this one transitional job is going to solve all the problems. It's unlikely. to do that. So maybe we just have to start thinking about this as a piece of a broader effort and of a longer effort, not just a one-time effort. And I'd like to think more broadly about subsidized jobs. You know, transitional jobs are just one model of a broader subsidized jobs piece. And as Dan said, the broader piece, you're usually not thinking about it as a one-time investment. You're thinking of it as an ongoing tool to connect people to employment. I'd like to learn a lot more about the possibilities of that ongoing tool and what it costs. And we can come back to policy implications later, but I'd like to learn more at that. And finally, I'm a labor economist, so I always think about what about the labor market context? Are there some labor market conditions in which all these programs are more effective than others? You know, my gut instinct is to say the tighter the labor market, the better. And right now we have a pretty tight labor market, and that's good because employers simply can't afford to be that choosy when they're having trouble hiring and retaining their most favored type of workers, so they might be more willing to take people on whom they otherwise might not. On the other hand, Dan talked about the experience of the emergency TANF program during the Great Recession, which was also seen as a success story by a lot of people. It's never been rigorously evaluated, but it's popular, and people felt it did have some successes. And in a recession, and part of what that program, it wasn't as tightly targeted on the hard to employ, which maybe lowered the stigma. All these programs tend to stigmatize. If you tell an employer this is a program for the hardest to employ, you've probably killed any chance that they have of really wanting to take these folks on. During the Great Recession, you didn't have the hardest of the hardest to employ, and a lot of people were out of work, and it seemed like employers weren't reacting so negatively to the candidates you brought forward. So you can make the case that, sometimes it's good to have a very strong economy with very high demand, sometimes in a recession, which kind of means in different labor market circumstances, you might want to structure these programs differently. Possibly with different kinds of goals to maximize your ability to get something out of it. So those are some of my thoughts and takeaways, and happy to talk more about those.
Thank you, guys. I told you that they wouldn't disappoint. So Dan and Cindy, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to, if you had any reactions or responses or wanted to sort of jump in.
I can just say one. I mean, you guys raised an incredible number of good points. I can't respond to all of them. I wrote down a few notes, but I feel bad sometimes being sort of a Monday morning quarterback after we evaluate something and then look back and say, oh, we knew that wasn't going to work, and I think the theory here, which didn't seem crazy, was that the best way for someone to learn to work is by working. And so we'll give them a job, and it's not a real job in the labor market, but it's a job that will employ this individual. They'll learn to get up in the morning, go to work, and they'll have a supervisor, and they'll sort of get used to those habits, and that will make them, more employable. And I think the way a lot of these programs have worked in practice, and Cindy can say if she disagrees, but there's a subsidized job, and people sort of work for a while. They get handed off to a job developer after 4 months or whatever it is, and the job developer helps them find a job. I don't feel like in most of them there was a lot of connection between all that and I think you were getting at this a little bit, Grant, taking advantage of what happened in the subsidized job to help sort of launch the person. It was more like hand them over to the job developer, and then they sort of do what they would have done if the person had just walked in the door without having just worked for 3 or 4 months in the subsidized job. And so I think, maybe there was a little naivety, initially about how much this would make somebody more employable, just the simple fact of working for 3 or 4 months. And, maybe it was a lot to expect, but I think that was sort of the theory, and, just one thought.
So I can try to respond to a couple of the comments. So Grant, you were asking about the men and women and whether we've seen differences. For the most part, most of the studies had such a small population of women in them that we really couldn't look at it, but we did anyway. But we can't say anything for sure. But the effects are just so different. They were a bit more positive for women, and I think in general we knew that from earlier, from supported work, that for women these programs tend to work a little bit better. But nothing definitive. But that's what we know. You were asking about the employers, the transition. So in the ETJD project, we had one site in Fort Worth that tried to place people with the private sector employer. And that was it was also a tapered, so they would pay their full wage for, I want to say 4 weeks, or 8 weeks, 4 weeks, no, 8 weeks, and then the next 8 weeks, it would be half of the wage. So I had the opportunity to interview some employers, which I found really fascinating to hear sort of what they were looking for out of it. And they really liked the opportunity that they could hire someone, not have to worry about, giving them benefits or worry about if they don't work out and then I'm gonna have to fire them, and because they could put all of that on the program. It didn't sound like, for the most part, they were taking advantage, that they really seemed like they went in with the intention of hiring people. So in terms of the out transition for that particular model, they weren't looking to transition them out. They actually wanted to keep them. But it could have been, it was part of the agreement. But they weren't, they really are looking for, stable employees. And I think that working with those employers, when job developers are able to do that, sometimes they can change their mind, but they have to already be of the mindset that they would change their mind about hiring someone with a record. And then, Harry, you were asking about a lot of things, more enhanced job readiness, certificates, and these are all the child support I found particularly interesting. I wish that we had more time to get into the results from ETJD and look at some of those enhancements, but some of those models were enhanced, and there is some, especially with the child support, we did see some really interesting effects that seem like they could be coming from the particular child support enhancement, the one where they reduced their orders, because it's sort of immediate. We had another program that also had a child support incentive, but it wasn't. It was reducing forgiving interest on arrears, which maybe felt a little less tangible, so we didn't see similar effects. But the one in San Francisco was really, in their paycheck, they saw a big difference. There could be something there. We don't know for sure, but it would have been nice. And some of these models, they were enhanced transitional jobs, and they tried out a lot of the enhancements that we're talking about in one form or another. And the effects were somewhat more positive on longer term outcomes, but still small. I don't want to say that we tested hard skills, though. That I wouldn't feel comfortable saying. Some of the programs had that component, but it was small and not really marketed, and I think they kind of saved it for the people a very limited number of people who really sought it out. So it would be interesting to test a skills model. I could keep talking, but I feel like I should stop.
If I could, Dan, I think the point you make about sort of a Monday morning quarterbacking, I understand that, but I feel like we're glossing over the point of the belief that something is a single bullet. To me, it is the fundamental flaw of the way our system is designed and operated, okay? I am not diminishing the importance of work one bit. It is fundamental. But that in and of itself don't get it done. And until we understand that the only way we're going to be able to significantly move the needle in service to vulnerable populations is to understand the whole context of their vulnerability and attempt to organize a set of supports around all of that, we're going to continue to have the substandard results that we have had.
It's always hard to go after Clarence. You always say such really...
Right?
Okay, so, I do want to leave some time for questions from folks, and we have a few minutes before we need to get to that. So I want to throw it back to you guys and say, so what? So, what does this mean for policy? What do we think this means for the next steps? What are your thoughts on that? So, Harry, since you went last time, how about you start us off?
By time. So I think, and again, following up on what both Grant and Clarence said, the idea of if you're going to do another round of these TJs, again, what more would you pack in? What more complementary services, more ongoing services, more coaching during and after the TJ ends, and some of these other things. And the public versus private sector thing, actually, I thought was quite interesting. Because the first time you glance at the diagrams, they look pretty similar. Bump up, but the public sector, you get a much bigger bump up in immediate, and then a much faster decline. In the private sector, it doesn't fall off nearly as quickly. This notion of, the really hardest of the hard to employ, the high risk, going only to the public sector, and really maybe focusing on the recidivism effects, whereas people one or two rungs up the ladder sending to the private sector, and that might be an interesting differentiation. So I can see more work with TJs, but I really want to try the broader subsidized jobs piece. And the way I would structure it is to send dollars, have some kind of competitive grant, and send these dollars to really distressed regions, distressed areas, where even in a 4% unemployment economy, it's clear that there are too few jobs for the people who need them, and see what you can generate in terms of employment for folks in that, and experiment and evaluate. Evaluate what it does to the local economy to have those kinds of injections. So to me, that's pretty high on the policy agenda. Getting away from this mindset of a one-time investment and of something maybe we might need to have ongoing, which leads me to one more point. And here, I'm going to stir the pot a little bit and pick a little bit of a fight with Clarence, not too much. Clarence, I heard when I heard you speak a few days ago, you presented all these things and all these goals for ACF, and they all sounded great, except for one, when you insisted on cost neutrality for all these programs. So what that means, and I even asked you just to make sure I understood, and you said that every dollar spent has to be offset somewhere else. And I'm sorry, I think that will wipe out everything that's been said on this panel. Requires more spending on these folks, not less. And I was on a panel before, not about hard to employ folks, but about community colleges. 3 great programs, all of which work, ASAP, Quest, and VITA, not for the hard to employ, but for a little higher up. But each costs 10 to 15 grand per participant, and if you have those kinds of numbers, you're not going to get cost neutrality from the public sector. Just not going to happen. There's this notion, there's this stereotype that we hear a lot from our conservative friends. It's, there's so much money we're already pouring into these programs. There's so much waste and so much overlap that's easy to carve out. And that's actually, there are too many programs, and there does need to be some consolidation. I think that's correct. America does not spend so much money on low-income people, period. America, the federal government spends 4% of GDP on means-tested programs, but half of that is Medicaid. Healthcare is so expensive in America that's, and then outside of that, it's 2% of GDP. 2% of GDP is just not a lot of money compared to almost every other industrialized country, and all those other countries have fewer poor people as a percentage of their population than we do. So I want to get away from this notion that, there's so much, and I won't even talk about tax cuts to millionaires in the trillions of dollars, and I won't go there. But really, so if we're going to be honest about everything that's been said on this panel by every single person, we got to get away from this notion that cost neutrality, because that's going to wipe out everything that might actually work for these folks, in my humble opinion.
Yes. I got to take a run at that, okay?
Imagine my surprise.
Okay. First of all, when we spend as a society, just federal and state government alone, annually, about $1 trillion in pursuit of service to vulnerable populations. My principal argument is not that we don't spend enough, it's that what we spend stupidly. Okay? A vast majority of our expenditures are on accessing the consumer, bringing the consumer into the system, not serving them, but literally the structure that brings them in, that acquires them. If we thought smarter, if it was our intention as a system to grow people through, and we restructured our spending, there would be more than enough spending to achieve the objective. We simply don't spend the dollars that we spend effectively. And so I would argue for restructuring spending before we say, we don't have enough, we need more.
So I'm going to try to do something with that.
All right.
I think I actually have a practical bridge of sort of both perspectives here. We do something alongside, so the notion is, I wrote it down several days ago. It says here, help policymakers understand that a job isn't always enough. So we all understand that, right? In the work that we do, not only are we doing the transitional jobs and subsidized employment, but we build something called circles of support. We have 21 different service site locations across 2 states. Each has its own circle of support. I've organized 1,299 mission-based organizations that don't charge us to help in service of the population continue to grow and move forward, because we're not thinking of the person just with a subsidy or just with a job, but we're actually thinking of all of the determinants that are going to weigh on this individual. So I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what those are. But in just about every one of our circles, we have 29 different domains. So it's a very broad set of supports that we organize on behalf of this person and their family. And I have to include that because sometimes the family, as many of you know, may weigh differently on the individual's ongoing pursuit of employment and or able to persist in employment. So we have to deal with that as well. So we're talking child abuse and neglect. Clothing is an obvious one. I'm going to just go through some of them. Education, family counseling. So there's cognitive behavioral therapy, child care, medical services, language services, legal child support, utilities, supportive housing. You know, that's just a broad sort of group, but we found it necessary. Otherwise, people don't persist. The other thing that I would add to that in terms of a practice is that it would make sense to screen people for asset building resources, even at the beginning of a transitional job, even if they're not eligible for them, just so that they can understand that work pays and that they can continue the forward progress, whether it's EITC, which Harry mentioned, but individual development accounts, whatever milieu is local that is there, I think it's worth doing. As far as next steps, I'll be brief. Find better ways to out-transition, put some structure on that. I already mentioned the notion about a job not being enough, and expect greater outcomes for long-term employment, I think is where we should start, and I think that's consistent with what Clarence said. And we do it, and so I'm not afraid to say it, but I think some portion of pay on performance in these models also help as well.
Erica, can I just add one other thing? Because I think, I just want to amplify something Cindy said, because I think it, we talk about, you know, the job is not enough, which I think everybody agrees. But it's sort of, I think there is a little bit of a sort of necessary but not sufficient piece to this, because when you have a subsidized job, it really is an opportunity to deliver lots of other things to people. It's really hard to engage people in all sorts of services. And not only does it, people come because they're getting paid, and most people want a job. And so they come. There's a structure to the day. There's other things that you can layer on it. These programs may have not done that particularly, but jobs are really, really useful, a useful way to provide other things.
Right, absolutely.
All right, so let's hear from you. I would encourage our viewers on the live stream that you can enter your questions on the live stream or send an email to 2018recs@gmail.com or tweet at RECSLive. But for those in the room, let's start here.
Hi, my name is Chris Pico. I'm from the Illinois Department of Human Services. I really appreciated the summary of the modest but measurable effect of subsidized employment, and I primarily direct this to Mr. Bloom. Can you summarize the research on what we know about how effective introducing or increasing work requirements are on people who are in public aid programs for increasing or sustaining employment?
No. I mean, I think we have evidence that mandatory sort of, welfare to work type programs did increase employment. Maybe a little, I have colleagues who could probably answer this a little better, separating the fact that the mandate versus the actual services that people got is a little hard, but, I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, and I can't say whether, more of a mandate, stricter sanctions are better than not, I don't know about that, but I think there is evidence that if you create a mandatory, a mandate to participate in employment activities or work, you do end up increasing employment.
Well, I'm partly asking from the kind of the frontline perspective, where if we have a new work requirement, the onus falls on our thousands of caseworkers to kind of explain how we're helping you by requiring you to work, otherwise you won't receive your benefits. And we struggle as an agency to try and frame that in a way that's constructive and realistic.
Could I make a comment about that? If you look purely at work requirements, so I'm thinking about the National Evaluation of Welfare to Work Strategies, there was an initial bump in employment, but after 5 years, any positive effects disappeared. So I think the evidence says if it's a mandate only, that probably was along the lines of what we've all said. Just forcing someone to work alone and doing nothing else does not enhance their long-term employability. Now, welfare reform in the 90s seemed to have had sort of a permanent effect on raising employment for less educated single moms. Some of the effect disappeared as time went on, but some of it didn't. But in some sense, you had a perfect storm of positive things. Not only did you have the stick of the work mandate, and of course, a lot of people were just driven off the rolls. You had the carrot of big expansions in the EITC, expansions in child care subsidies, rising minimum wage, and of course, in the late 90s, a very, very tight labor market, which pushed and pulled a lot of folks. So maybe the work mandate by itself is not going to be a silver bullet. Oh, and by the way, you have to add, as always, you have to think of the costs as well as the benefits and the people who are kicked off. And if you want to think about, there's a guy named Peter the Citizen who writes a lot about the TANF.
I know him.
I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. Disabuses us of the notion that just sort of wealth, if it's just wealthy, if you just hit these people enough, that you'll do. But combining it within a package of broader supports and broader incentives, in the right kind of labor market could possibly do some good. Again, I'm going to argue that doing it right often costs more money, not less. But that's how I think about it. Depending on how it's done and what it's combined with, it could be more or less positive.
And I would build on that, Chris, and say again, and it's consistent with what I've said and heard the rest of the panel say, if the way that your frontline worker is explaining this is just go to work, then they ain't explaining it right. Okay? Again, it has to be. We have to approach work as a part of a fuller prescription for human well-being and growth. And as if we approach it and operate it in that context, it can work. But no one thing, no just telling somebody to go to work, no, that's not going to solve the problem that we're trying to solve.
Thank you all for the great information and recommendations you provided today. My name is Amanda Avens, and I'm with Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona. We're proud to partner with our Federal Bureau of Prisons and our Arizona Department of Corrections to provide occupational training inside the prisons. Can you talk about recommendations for moving forward for the next stage on how those career and technical skills that I heard you all talk about can be important added to that job factor, how that plays with what happens inside the prison, and how you see Department of Education and specifically Title IV fitting in with some recommendation moving forward for transitional job supports?
So how do I think it's great. It's a great opportunity to, if services can start, especially education and training while people are still inside, I don't see any downside. Why not take advantage of that time to help them build skills? There's not much rigorous research out there that suggests that would be effective. It's very difficult to operate training programs and education programs in the prison setting because of, I'm sure you're aware of all the security and the moves and the in and out. And equally, and from a research perspective, the people who qualify and are interested in those programs while they're incarcerated are, very motivated, a specific subset of people. So I think, I don't see any downside in offering it. I think it would be great. Especially you have to get Department of Corrections to participate and be cooperative, but this.
If I could say one other thing that I would build on that, I think that a point that Dan raised in his presentation, the individuals who are helping with the intervention have to understand the environment because they can. It's almost like the convening part of a 12-step program. When a group of people get together, they understand the experience. And so I believe that being able to have individuals who understand that incarceration experience and the bridge to the other side as being part of the intervention, I think it's really important.
I guess, so we all agree that it's hard to do good career and tech ed in prison. You don't have the equipment. There's all kinds of things. Therefore, so a couple of things. Again, number one, differentiating the prisoners to see who can more benefit from these services versus who can less. At a minimum, trying to get people GEDs for the people who are closer to that. But really working on that work readiness piece and job readiness in terms of helping them understand what to expect. And by the way, federal prison industries has not been a great tool to enhance subsequent employability, right? And one of the problems is we pay people very little for the work they do when they're behind bars, which doesn't exactly give them a positive experience with work. So I would argue that they have to be better compensated if you're going to have either something like work release or some real work besides just folding the laundry or working in the kitchen, that it should be compensated while you focus on the work readiness piece for those who are, in some sense, closer to the line and ready to be helped.
All right, well, there's someone who really wants to ask a question. We're at time, so we have just a couple minutes. Come on up. Sorry, it's like a labyrinth to get to the microphone, but there you go.
I'm from Virginia, Department of Social Services, and my question is, in the research, did you or could you include information about what was the status or condition of these individuals before they were unemployed? Had they been unemployed for 3 years? What was the condition before they were incarcerated? Because there's a difference between someone who was, had a job, embezzled, was incarcerated, they get out. When you're lumping everybody into one category of incarcerated, I think the effects of these programs can be different. So I guess my question is, could you or do you get information about their experience prior to the program?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So on the research, we collect administrative data, and we try to get at how much they were working, both a combination of administrative data as well as asking them at baseline about the prior 3 years. Now with the formerly incarcerated people, I can say that their employment history is quite spotty. Most of them had worked at some point, but then we find maybe half of them ever worked for 6 months at a time. So we try to measure it that way. I think the non-custodial parents and the TANF populations have a little more recent work experience, but for the formerly incarcerated that we focused on in these studies, they've been in and out of prison. It's not their first offense, and they had issues before.
If we took a more person or family-centered approach to our service, we would have to begin serving any individual or family with a robust assessment of who they are and what are the set of challenges that they're facing. So instead of just trying to put any particular intervention on, that intervention has to happen in the context of understanding who it is that we're serving. But in our sort of cookie cutter environment where we think, we're going to give you what I got, whether or not what I got is of value to you, that won't help us ultimately help that individual or family create the path that they need.
So we just have one quick question, last one.
Thank you.
And I mean it this time.
I'm Megan Reed from the University of Wisconsin's Institute for Research on Poverty. So my question is just kind of given the ongoing racial discrimination and hiring practices, especially among people with criminal justice histories. I was wondering if you looked at or found any differential impacts by race and ethnicity within these program evaluations. And if not, or even if so, I was wondering if you've thought of additional research questions you could ask that could get at that more. Like, for example, I was wondering if maybe subsidies might change employer behaviors in these areas, or many other questions like that.
Yeah, so I mean, in our studies, the majority of the population is Black or Hispanic, so the subgroup analysis isn't as robust as we would like it to be. We generally haven't found differences, though, when we have been able to look at impacts by race and ethnicity, other than to say that Hispanics sometimes have more positive effects. But yeah, I don't know if that answered your question or was helpful. But anything to add?
No, I mean, it wasn't a huge amount of variation.
Yeah.
But, I mean, one way to think about that, the Diva Pager work, for instance, which says, there's a strong incarceration effect, there's a strong race effect. Even if they're not interactive, Black ex-offenders simply start with 2 big strikes against them rather than 1. So even if the impact of the treatment is the same, it still leaves many fewer of them further from the starting line. And that's a case potentially, and again, not with people reading at the 6th grade level, not with people that still have a substance problem, but for people who, reading at the 9th or 10th, that really could be along the lines of the previous question, more employable. Some of this discrimination is what economists call statistical discrimination.
Right.
Absent any real information about the individual, people fall back in a stereotype. But if you have person-specific information, if the job developer has it, and you can sort of say, look, this individual's done some positive stuff, and they've completed these efforts, and they have a good record of work while some of those things, my guess is could chip away at the employer's fear, which is likely to be greater with Black men than with white or Latino men.
Thank you.
All right. Well, before we thank our panel, I just want to invite people. There is a Young Professionals Happy Hour happening at the Marriott Marquis, so not here, down the street, for those that are interested. And I think the conference starts back up tomorrow morning at 8:30. But I promised you a great session. I think we delivered. So please join me in thanking our panelists.